Welcome to the Gnostic Informant. I'm Jesus, the Logos incarnate, and you are about to attain true Gnosis.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true Gnosis. Today I'm with up and coming rising star Joe Schmid, who's on his way to be one of the top philosophers of our time. Hopefully, I mean you already got it down, but you're still furthering your education, which is great. I have to show everybody this is your PhilPeople account. I guess we get what is it, account page. Yeah. And it has a link to your website as well, which I will now show that. So you guys can check this out. Links are all in the description, by the way. Here it is. Yeah, so this is, I was looking through this last night. You got tons of stuff, interesting stuff in here, man. You really are like, I feel a little dumber sometimes when I'm reading through. Like how do you know all this? And it's such a young age. How old are you, by the way?
I am 21.
No. What is going on, dude? Yeah, you're a brilliant thinker, and I'm really just happy to have you on and talk about this stuff. And wow, 21, that's incredible. But also, I wanted to save best for last. Your YouTube channel, which is right here. So this channel, you upload some really good content. So guys, subscribe, hit that bell, just as you see me do. And he has 20 cosmological
Yeah.
This one I watched the other day, the 100 Arguments for God Answered. The title, well, you'll see if you click on it, but it's a really good video, and it's really, you get down to it, and you're checking out our friend Cameron from Capturing Christianity. And then I saw your interview with him, by the way, too. It was really good chat, really good discussion. And I like your approach to everything. You're trying to be fair. You're trying to really seek the truth. You're not trying to play on any team. You're not team atheism. You're not team theism. You're team truth. You're team what is the truth here? And it's very rare. I mean, we all have our biases. I do too. It's very rare to actually keep yourself grounded in the neutral area where you're trying to be fair to all sides and trying to find the truth. And if there, hey, look, this might be evidence for God here. That's possibility. I'm going to say that. I'm not just going to be like, we shouldn't tell them about this because it might further the Christian agenda. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, that happens. So yeah, that's why I really like your style and your approach, and I'm glad to have you on, man.
Yeah, no, I'm super excited to be here. And the audience doesn't know this, but before we went live, you asked if there was one philosopher that I could kind of wish to not only emulate, but kind of further the ideas of, kind of take up the torch and bear it for them. I actually said Josh Rasmussen, because he's not the kind of, shall we say, he's not the type where it's, you think of maybe a slimy apologist for a particular position. He's not trying to do that, right? Instead, what he's doing is he's trying to serve people through his research, and he's trying to really get at the truth, and he's trying to follow it wherever he leads. I mean, he tells his students, for instance, don't believe something just because I say it, right? Try to see for yourself, try to think for yourself, come to reasoned conclusions using the lights of reason and experience and all these sorts of things. So I answered Josh Rasmussen because I see him as this kind of paradigm of placing truth first and really being on the same team, trying to get at the truth.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I can see you being someone that's like that, someone that's, yeah, exactly. That's exactly how I view your approach to all these complex, deep thoughts and worldviews, and trying to weigh one against the other. Like, I think you have I think you are a good resource for finding that information out.
Yeah, hopefully, especially that 12-hour long video.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see where you go going forward, because you're so young and you're already at a level that's way higher than 99% of the people that go through this life. You know what I mean? Most people don't get. I mean, it's not because we're all dumb or anything, but it's not has the opportunities and stuff like that. But you, man, you're in the right place, and I'm really interested to see where you go with the way you push philosophy.
Absolutely. And I mean, we all have different opportunities, different gifts, and so on. And so, I mean, I really want to serve people with it. So that's really what I'm trying to do with my sort of public work. So
awesome. So let's get into the topic at hand. It's but we're not going to get too much into the philosophy of Spinoza, but just these three particular things. Deism. What was the other one? Necessitarianism.
Yeah.
Tell us what that is, first of all.
Yeah. So I guess we could probably step back and talk about what modality is. So modality is the study of possibility and necessity. So you can think of modality, it's kind of like modes. It's like different ways in which something might exist. So something can exist in a necessary way, or something can exist in a contingent way, for instance. So that's what modality is. We're talking about possibility and necessity. So then when we ask what necessitarianism is, we have to get this distinction in mind between necessary truths and necessary things on the one hand, and contingent truths and contingent things on the other hand. So the best way that I like to explain this is in terms of possible worlds. And so, this is a pretty big in contemporary philosophy, but we kind of just use this as a heuristic device. We're not necessarily talking about these like distant universes that are somehow causally isolated from us and they really exist. We're not talking about that. We're just using this as a kind of heuristic, as a tool, as a device to talk about different ways that reality could be. So a possible world is just a complete or total way that reality could be. So the actual world, the world in which we find ourselves, the one in which we live, move, and have our being, as it were, that is a possible world. But another possible world is one where it's pretty much exactly like the actual world, but maybe I sneezed 10 minutes ago. I didn't actually sneeze 10 minutes ago. So suppose that I had, the world would have been slightly different, but that whole history, everything that happens, everything that's true, that would have been a different possible world. And so, again, possible worlds are different ways that reality as a whole, as a complete totality, could have been. Different ways that it could have been. So now, what is a necessary truth? Well, it's something that's true in every possible world. It's something that's true no matter which way that reality could be. So it's something that must be true. It cannot fail to be true, right? No matter which way that reality turned out to be, it would still be true. So if I had sneezed, it would still be true. If there were no universe, it would still be true, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And a necessarily existent thing, or a necessary being, or a necessary thing, we could say, is just something that exists in all possible worlds. So it must exist. It cannot fail to exist. By contrast, a contingent truth is something that's true in some worlds, but false in other worlds. So presumably, we tend to think, I am a contingent thing. It's a contingent truth that I exist. Because maybe my parents never met. That could have been the case. It could have been the case that my parents never met, and then I wouldn't have come into existence. And so there are some possible worlds in which I exist, and other possible worlds in which I don't exist. And that makes, firstly, the statement Joe exists, that makes that contingent It's contingently true because it's true in the actual world, but it makes it contingent because it's true in some worlds, but not in others. And moreover, I'm a contingent being because I exist in some worlds and I don't exist in other worlds. Okay, and that brings us to Necessitarianism. So Necessitarianism, which some people say is arguably what Spinoza committed to because he had this PSR, which I'm sure we'll probably talk about a little bit.
Yeah.
But Necessitarianism says that every truth is a necessary truth. Everything is a necessarily existent thing. So actually, it's false that my parents could have failed to meet. It's necessarily the case that they meet at that particular time, that particular date, and so on. Every single thing is necessarily the case. Every truth is a necessary truth. So if you think that you could have failed to exist, think again. You must exist. And the exact date of your conception that had to occur, the exact date at which you die that had to be there, nothing could have been different. So there's only one possible world. That's what this amounts to. It's saying there's only one way that reality could be. It's a pretty radical thesis, but it's very interesting. And there are some surprisingly good arguments for it. But yeah.
And this sort of, because then you ask it begs the question, was there a first mover? Is everything cause and effect? Are we just playing this thing out? We think we're making choices, but really it's our brain just reflexing every cause that comes our way.
Yeah.
It opens a lot of questions up. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think Spinoza had a quote actually where he's something like, again, I don't quite remember the exact quote, but it was something like, people think themselves free because they're unaware of the various necessitating causal factors for their actions and their desires and their decisions and so on. So This is kind of pointing to this this topic that you're bringing up, which is the interplay between freedom and the seeming obvious fact of contingency. Like, it seems so obvious that I could have chosen otherwise on various different occasions. It's bringing up that tension between that on the one hand and necessitarianism on the other. So yeah, arguably this conception of freedom where you have to have the ability to do otherwise, like you had to genuinely have been able to choose A instead of B when you in fact chose B, arguably you're not going to be able to have that if indeed this necessitarianism is true, because you couldn't have done otherwise, right? There's no possible way that reality could be different. And if there's no possible way that reality could be different, then you couldn't have done otherwise. You have no ability to do otherwise. And so it seems as though at least that notion of free will is going to have to be thrown out if you accept necessitarianism. And I mean, it's interesting because philosophers being quite creative, think that there are different notions of freedom. So that kind of freedom, what you could call leeway freedom, because it's like a garden of forking paths or whatever, like you could choose A or B, you kind of have leeway in between them. Some philosophers say, well, actually, that's not really the freedom that we care about. That's not the freedom that matters. Even if we don't have that freedom, we can still have a robust sense of free will. And that sense is that we can at least be the appropriate sources of our actions, or that when we act, we can be appropriately reasons responsive. So we're responsive to our reasons. We act on the basis of our own desires that weren't like manipulated by other people. And we kind of wholeheartedly endorse those desires, our second order desires about our desires. They're in line with one another. So a lot of philosophers think that we can still have a notion of freedom that doesn't require that ability to do otherwise, even if we have this kind of determinism, or what we can say necessitarianism. And I mean, I guess there's one way that I could try to bring this out. And it's an example by a philosopher named, I think his first name is Harry Frankfurt. And these are called Frankfurt cases. So some people in your audience might be aware of this, but some might not. So imagine that someone is about to vote between two politicians. And so as not to get political, let's just call them politician A and politician B. So this person is about to go into the voting booth and so on. Now, unbeknownst to this person who's about to vote between candidate A and candidate B, this nefarious neuroscientist has implanted in this person's brain some monitoring device. And this monitoring device allows the neuroscientist from afar to kind of monitor the various goings on in the brain, and perhaps even in the mind. Maybe it has some sort of transmission signal that can take, if there's some sort of soul, it can take what's going on in the soul and transmit it and tell it to the neuroscientist. Again, this is just an imagined case.
Right.
And so this neuroscientist, this nefarious neuroscientist, can kind of monitor the deliberation process as this person is about to vote for candidate A or candidate B. And what the neuroscientist does is, if the person who's voting is going to vote for candidate B on their own without intervention, then the neuroscientist is not going to do anything. They're just going to monitor, but they're not going to step in and like kind of tweak certain dials on their remote control to change which way the person would go. So if the person decides to choose B on their own, the neuroscientist does nothing. But if the neuroscientist sees in the brain activity or in the activity of the mind that the person is about to vote for A, the neuroscientists would come in, they'd manipulate the person and make them vote for B. Okay, so now suppose that the person actually votes for candidate B of their own accord without kind of any intervention from without. Well, intuitively, right, this person freely chose candidate B, right? There's no intervention. The neuroscientist did absolutely nothing. It's literally as if you or I just went in and voted for candidate B. Nothing happened here. But nevertheless, this person couldn't have done otherwise. They couldn't have voted for candidate A, because had they even showed any sign of like going that way, the neuroscientist would have came in, manipulated them, and forced them to go B. So this person couldn't have done otherwise. They don't have the ability to do otherwise. And yet they're still free, and we can hold them responsible and so on. So that's a monumentally interesting and monumentally controversial example. And there's been a huge literature on this, but it's something interesting. It's to give you guys something to think about, that you might actually still be able to have some notion of freedom and responsibility, even if this kind of necessitarianism is true.
Wow, that's fascinating. It made me think of, I have a friend of mine who was a Shia Muslim, and he believes that Allah is in control of everything that happens. And he can just make sure that all this stuff goes the way it goes. And he just convinced, he's convinced of it. Okay. And it's like one step close. It's very close to what you're saying, but not the same, but it's close, because he's in control. He's letting things happen, but he can also change those things if he wanted to.
Yeah, exactly. It's like God is almost that nefarious neuroscientist in that case. Like, if he wants you to choose B and he sees you'll do it of your own accord, he can kind of do nothing because he sees that that's what you're going to do. But if he knows that you're going to go astray, or he thinks and reasonably believes that you would go astray, he can kind of intervene and push you to that other direction. And, there's a question as to whether or not that would intervene with your free will. It's an interesting question. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you connect that with debates about God, because, there is this question: if there is this God in control of everything that created everything, isn't God in some sense kind of pulling all the strings about what happens in creation? Does God kind of take his hands off the wheel and let some things genuinely go that he doesn't either foresee or that he doesn't control? Like, you get some really interesting questions about God's existence, God's nature, the way in which God operates with respect to creation. Is he some kind of domineering parent that like meticulously controls absolutely every single fact? Or maybe is he a more laissez-faire kind of parent and just maybe lets the creatures themselves choose various directions?
This would pose a question. It would actually be a problem for a lot of theists in the, like, Christians and Jews who think about sin happening in the garden. So, because then you had this God who can step in at any moment and say, Eve, don't take that. But he didn't do it. So it's like, then you have to say it's his choice that it happened. So this would be, I don't know, I feel like these would clash.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. I mean, it depends on how the theist wants to conceive of freedom. I mean, if they want to say that being determined in some way, like being necessitated in some sense by prior factors, if they want to say that that's compatible with our having free will and moral responsibility, well then, yeah, you do get into these really tricky issues. Because if we can be determined and yet still free and responsible, well then you can ask, why didn't God determine us all to freely do the good on all occasions, right? Because we can still be free in that case, given this kind of compatibilism. That's the thesis that philosophers hold when they say that this kind of determination or necessitation from prior factors, when that's compatible with free will, they're called compatibilists. So if you have compatibilism, you do get into some really tricky weeds, because presumably, yeah, God could have determined us, he could have necessitated us to do the right thing on every single occasion, and yet we are still free because those are compatible per this kind of view. Now, some theists, in order to get around that, they might reject compatibilism. They'll say, no, we actually do have to have those alternative possibilities. So that's one way that they could go. But it's interesting. You're kind of nailing something on the head, a serious problem that afflicts those kinds of philosophers who hold that.
Now, I want to get into this sufficient reason, principle of sufficient reason thing. But first, what do you see any problems with this going necessitarianism? Like, is there any other theories or opposing viewpoints that point out some problems with this?
Yeah, so there definitely are. There are lots of different objections, and we can't hope to survey them all.
Right.
I guess I'll just go over two objections. So one of them is indeed from philosophers who are not compatibilists but think that we have free will, right? So they think, no, you can't have free will if you are determined or necessitated by prior conditions, but we do have free will. And so that tells us that we aren't necessitated or determined by prior conditions, in which case necessitarianism would be false. There are different ways that reality could have turned out, for instance, if I had made a different choice freely. So that's one way that some philosophers push back. They say, obviously, we have free will. We hold each other morally responsible. We say that Hitler shouldn't have done what he did. And since Hitler shouldn't have done what he did, it seems as though, like, if I say you shouldn't have done something or you should have done something, it seems as though it has to be the case that you could have refrained from doing that thing or could have done that thing. Like, if I'm tied to a chair and there's like unfortunately, there's a baby drowning over there or something like that, but I'm tied to a chair and I can't even move. If someone came along and said, Joe, you should have saved that baby, I'm going to be like, what? No, I was tied to a chair. I couldn't have, right? And so my defense of my moral standing there is, no, I couldn't have saved the baby. And so it's not the case that I should have, because I couldn't have. And what that tells us is that if it is the case that I should have saved the baby, well, then I could have, right? It's a necessary condition on the truth of I should have saved the baby, that I could have saved the baby. That's a necessary condition for it being the case that I should have saved the baby. And if that's the case, well, then in order for us to say something like, you shouldn't have done that, or Hitler shouldn't have exterminated Jews, in order to say that, you would have to say that Hitler could have refrained from exterminating the Jews. But of course, he didn't, in fact, do that. And so we have an alternative way that reality could be. And so necessitarianism would be false then. So that's something that some philosophers have tried to push back on. Another thing, this is the second kind of worry, is some people just think this is obviously false. That's just something that you could say, like,
It just feels that way.
Yeah, like, listen, like, I'm just wiggling my finger and like, yeah, I'm just wiggling it. Like, surely I could have wiggled one more time, like up or down or something like, or like I blinked, let's say, I don't know a realistic number, but let's say 2,500 times today, or 2,512. Let's say that that's the exact number so far. Surely it could have been 2,511 or like 2,513. Like, why would it be this like metaphysically necessary fact about reality that it's 2,512? It just seems so arbitrary. And it really seems like it could have been otherwise. So like these sorts of things, when you reflect on it, a lot of people think that necessitarianism is obviously false, just because it really seems like I could have chosen to like not have my glasses on. I could have sneezed 10 minutes ago. Various things could have happened that did not in fact happen. So those are two reasons why some philosophers push back on it.
And what is crazy about it, I agree that that's pretty, I think it's self-evident that there's problems. But when you actually think about it, like everything that happens is a result of the first second of the Big Bang. Like everything's just happening as a result of something before it. So you kind of have to, when you think about it like that, it does seem like we're all just, everything's just playing out. But at the same time, we all have a brain, which we can think and have thoughts, and we can interpret things, and we can say things to people. We can manipulate the world around us. So it's pretty obvious that we're not just like robots.
Yeah, exactly. Well, no, that's interesting. And I mean, some people point out to quantum mechanics as also as an objection to necessitarianism, because there are some interpretations of quantum mechanics where various quantum phenomena at the really, really small micro level occur without being necessitated to occur from prior conditions. So it's a kind of what philosophers call indeterminism. It's not, the relevant phenomena are not determined or necessitated by prior conditions. So like, given all those prior conditions, like when you shoot, let's say, an electron or a particular particle at a little two slits, like a right and a left slit, like given all the same prior conditions, the particle still genuinely could have gone either right or left, and there's a certain probability. So the might be a 50% probability right, 50% probability left, or whatever. And in that case, the particles going through, okay, sorry, I broke up a little bit. In that case, the particles going through one of those slits, right, would not be necessarily the case, because given the exact same initial conditions, it had a 50% chance of going that other way. And this is like an objective chance. It's not like given our ignorance. So like that's one view of quantum mechanics. Now there are other views, but that's another, I guess that's a third objection that people could raise. And I mean, you do make a good point. Like if there is this kind of causal unfolding of reality where, let's say each moment of time is in some sense brought about by different things that earlier times, or each happening is caused by earlier happenings, tracing all the way back to the Big Bang and perhaps even beyond, you might worry about does that mean that everything is everything necessitated by prior conditions? And I guess there are two things that you could say with respect to that. Firstly, you can say that there are instances of causation that aren't necessitating causation. So it's a kind of indeterministic causation. You could have a cause, but it only raises the probability of the effect, let's say, but doesn't determine or necessitate that the effect comes about. Right. So the quantum events might be examples of that. So that's the first thing you say. The second thing you could say is that, well, even if it's true that everything is necessitated by a prior condition tracing back to, let's say, the first moment of time or the Big Bang or whatever, you could still say, well, the Big Bang itself could have had slightly different initial conditions. Maybe, it had an actual temperature of, let's such and such Kelvin, but it could have been such and such -1 Kelvin or such and such +1 Kelvin. And then that could have reality unfold in different ways because you could just have different initial conditions. That's one thing that you could say.
And another thing, I was listening to Dawkins. I think he was talking to Jordan Peterson. Yeah, it was. And they were like talking. He was like asking him, like, what do you think sort of in your mind is one of the things that would favor you towards believing in a God? And he said our reality with constants, like the speed of light, like constants basically. And he makes a good point though. For what we're saying, everything has started off. The universe has a cause, but there's these constants in the universe. It sort of is one tiny bit makes you think, okay, why is it that way? Why doesn't the speed of light change? Because it doesn't. It's like that is a good point. I would say that's one thing that I would say that sort of tips the scale back into that way of saying this could be true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I'm not saying that it makes it true, but it's like it's just one more thing that I would point out.
Yeah, it's almost like an indicator of sorts.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think you wanted to get to the PSR, right?
Yeah, because of that, yeah.
All right. So I guess I'll just lay out what it is and why some people think it entails Necessitarianism. So the PSR, or Principle of Sufficient Reason, can be articulated in various different ways. So there really isn't the PSR. There are lots of different versions of the PSR. It's similar to cosmological arguments, right? It's more so like a family of arguments. You have the Kalam cosmological argument. You have kind of Thomistic style cosmological arguments. You have contingency cosmological arguments. So anyway, there are lots of different cosmological arguments. They represent a family. Similarly, the PSR is kind of like a family. It's not really the PSR, but the PSRs almost. So here's one version that a lot of the kind of, I almost said ancient, but these guys aren't ancient, right? These are just like Leibniz and Spinoza. So this is early modern. So a lot of these early modern philosophers articulated it as, for everything that exists and everything that occurs and every fact, every truth, there's a sufficient reason or cause as to why it is the way it is rather than some other way. So for instance, let's say what's an example? These glasses, let's say, are 4 ounces. I have no clue how much ounces weigh, but they're 4 ounces. According to them, the fact that my glasses are 4 ounces has to have a sufficient reason or cause that explains why it is exactly 4 ounces as opposed to 5 ounces or fewer ounces, why my glasses exist at all in the first place. Everything has to have a sufficient reason as to why it exists, something that explains why it exists, why it occurs, why it's true, rather than it not existing or not occurring or being false. So that's basically the PSR. Everything that exists, every fact has an explanation, has a sufficient reason that explains why it exists or occurs or is true, as opposed to not existing or not occurring or being true.
Right.
So yeah, that is the PSR that, for instance, I think that Leibniz and Spinoza would adopt. Now, contemporary philosophers restrict the PSR. They might say, well, we're not talking about everything that exists, but maybe everything contingent. Or maybe they'll say it doesn't have to have a sufficient reason that explains why it exists rather than not. It just has to have at least some partial explanation. It's something that removes some mystery as to why it obtains. But it doesn't have to explain why it's exactly 4 ounces rather than 4.1. I mean, we just have to have some sort of partial explanation. These are different ways that philosophers have kind of modified the PSR. But let's just stick with the kind of early modern PSR that Spinoza, Leibniz, these sorts of thinkers would adopt. Why might we think that entails Necessitarianism? Well, take the fact that there are any contingent things at all, or that there are the contingent things that there are. Now, this is clearly itself a contingent fact, because if I had ceased to exist, I'm contingent. If I had ceased to exist, well, then the particular contingent things that there are would have been different. It would have been populated by a different collection of things, right? Because I would have been absent from it. So what we're doing right now is we are considering the collection of contingent things that there are, and that is itself a contingent collection. It doesn't have to exist. And so per this PSR, this collection has to have some kind of sufficient reason or explanation for why it exists rather than not. But we clearly can't explain that in terms of some contingent thing, because that's part of the very thing that we're trying to explain, right? That's part of the collection that we're trying to seek an explanation for why it's there at all in the first place. So we can't cite something contingent to explain it. Instead, we have to cite something necessary to explain it. But if we're citing something necessary to explain it, right, a necessary thing that is sufficient for something else, right?
Yeah.
That other thing has to be necessary if it's sufficient for it, right? If it's a sufficient condition such that given the first thing, you're automatically going to get the second thing, then the second thing has to be necessary if the first thing is necessary. Wow. And so if you have a necessary being or necessary entity or whatever, which is sufficiently explaining something else, that other thing has to be necessary. And so you wouldn't be able to explain this contingent fact, right? Because we supposed that it was contingent. And so on the assumption that firstly, it's contingent, and secondly, the PSR is true, we get a kind of a contradiction because it's contingent, but the PSR led us to this necessary being, and that necessary being had to sufficiently explain it, but then it wouldn't be contingent, it'd be necessary. So we kind of have to choose. We have to choose between the PSR and there being these contingent things. And so given the PSR, it follows that there are no contingent things whatsoever. Everything is necessary. That's why you get Necessitarianism from this version of the PSR, which is the version that the early moderns would kind of hold, where it's a sufficient explanation. It explains why something obtains rather than something else.
That's very fascinating. It almost makes you wonder, like, is there an infinite, like, if there was a first mover, would there be an infinite first movers? Is there a first mover that's moving the mover and then another mover that's moving that, and does it keep going? And like, I don't know. And what's the end game for this universe? Where is this? What's going to happen? Are we going to get to a state where AI takes over and becomes a god itself, and then creates a new universe? And is that the purpose of everything? I'm just throwing stuff out there.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's interesting when you think about all these sorts of things. But I mean, what's interesting is that the PSR, like the argument that I gave, like maybe there are infinitely many contingent things, maybe they stand in infinitely many causal relations or whatever. We can still ask, well, what explains why there are those contingent things, right? And per the PSR, it's going to have some kind of sufficient explanation. Right. And because it can't be in terms of one of those very contingent things, you're going to have to cite something necessary. But if it's necessary, then it's sufficiently explaining something else. It's going to guarantee it because it's sufficient for it. And so you're going to get this kind of what philosophers call modal collapse. Everything collapses into necessity. So everything is necessary. So it's interesting that you point that out. Like, yeah, even you could bring in infinitely many causes or whatever. You're still going to get this kind of modal collapse where everything is necessary if you have this early modern version of the PSR.
Right. That's very fascinating stuff. Let's get into some super chats. Well,
absolutely.
Why don't we? This is the first. Oh, sorry, skip one. All right, let me go back. Sorry about that. Mummy Vale, thank you for the super chat. Is the Neoplatonic Monad the same as Deism?
Interesting. So here's what I think the person is asking. The Neoplatonic Monad, are they, maybe I can ask you, are they referring to the one? You know how Plotinus in his Aeneads, he had this the one, where it's just this absolutely, yeah. So it's the one with a capital O. This is like, it's sort of similar to God, but like not really. Well, anyway, there's interpretive difficulties with Plotinus, but set that aside. As I understand it, you can have this kind of non-theistic version of the one. Now, what is the one? Well, it's like unity itself. It's like pure being. It's like this absolutely simple reality, and everything else flows from it. This whole diversity of things ultimately is due to this one, this absolutely simple one. So it's like, it's the source, the foundation of all, the ground of being, as it were. So you can kind of see how this is similar to how theists conceive of, or some theists think of God, right? God is the ground of being. Everything else traces back to him. He's this utterly unified being. But I mean, you can conceive of this one as just an impersonal singularity almost. It's just like this single, absolutely simple fount of reality, right?
A personality. It just could be energy or whatever.
Well, and it's also hard to, or maybe even not even cast it in scientific terms. It's just maybe this like almost unspeakable other. It's just this transcendent one. Yeah, and so, I mean, you said it doesn't have to be personality. It's difficult to see how it could be a personality. I mean, if
Right.
it's absolutely simple, you'd think that a personality, like, it has desires which are different from its reasons, and then which are different from its actions, and so it wouldn't be absolutely simple, so it seems.
Well, Plato, going back to Plato himself, but way before the Neoplatonists, he makes it clear this can't be a jealous God, which I
Yeah.
think is hilarious that a lot of Christians call themselves Neoplatonists, whatever. Not all of them, but some of them do. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Doesn't this guy have to be perfect and not jealous? But whatever. I digress.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's hard to read the Old Testament and see that that's a perfect being, but
Right.
but anyway, set that aside. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to even see how it could be personal if it's this absolutely simple principle of everything that explains why absolutely everything exists. So anyway, I think that's what this person is referring to when they say the Neoplatonic Monad. It's this transcendent one. It's this unity behind all diversity. This source of everything, ground of being. Is that the same as deism? Well, I guess you could potentially render it in deistic fashion, although it's difficult. And the reason why it's difficult is because, at least as I understand deism, they still think God is like personal, or in some sense he has personal attributes. It's just he doesn't really interact with the creation. He kind of just created it and doesn't really care, give a shit about it as it evolves on. So like, but still, it's an intelligent agent, right? It's some sort of agent with the ability to choose and so on. So is it compatible with it? Well, I'm not quite sure. I mean, if we have this Neoplatonic one, it's going to have to be absolutely simple. It's the principle of all. It's this unifying factor that explains the diversity of things. And if it's absolutely simple, it's hard to see how it could be personal as it would be required under deism. So it's hard to see that it could be personal, because then it would have to have desires, it'd have to have reasons. Its reasons would have to be different from its actions. It would have various conscious states which are different from one another, etc. So you might be able to make it work, but it'll probably be implausible.
It's a good point. Good question. Good question and good answer. Gaius Julius Windex, thanks for the super chat. Always good seeing you in the chat, buddy. Do you think libertarian free will is true?
Oh, this is so difficult. So the free will debate is just atrociously difficult. What do I think? Well, okay, so let me just start at the basics. I do think we have something like free will. I think that's plausible. And by free will, I just mean this. It's the ability to control one's actions in such a way that you can be responsible for them. That's all that I mean. So in that sense, yes, I think we have free will. I think that's arguably just like a datum of my experience. I think it's really, really plausible, almost like self-evident. But the question is that free will of a libertarian variety? And the libertarians, they tend to say that that's the notion of free will, but that notion of free will is not compatible with being determined by prior factors or being necessitated by prior factors. And for me, I don't know. I don't know whether or not that libertarian view is true. I gave that example earlier. Remember the Frankfurt case of the person voting between A and B? Lots of philosophers are actually, the majority of philosophers tend to think that that example is a really good example showing that you don't need the ability to do otherwise in order to act freely. You can be such that given the prior conditions, you had to go some certain outcome. You had to go that way. That's actually compatible with free will. That's what a lot of philosophers tend to think. So for me, I'm kind of agnostic on it. I honestly don't know. The debates are super complex.
Wow, interesting. Interesting answer. Myth Vision Podcast, Derek, what's up? Yeah, if you haven't subscribed to Myth Vision, then I don't know what you're doing. Get out there and subscribe and come right back. Anyways, is Joe Schmid a Christian? If yes, why? If no, why? Interesting.
Yeah, so no, I am not. I advise. So I think that's Derek Lambert, right?
Yeah.
So I advise Derek to check out my video. Why am I agnostic? I made that video a long while back, but it's a very good video, if I do say so myself, if I do toot my own horn. Or, for instance, you could check out my monolithic 12-hour video. I would recommend it because I criticize and go through lots of these different apologetics type arguments. So the answer as to why I'm not would be found in these sorts of videos. But I guess I can just briefly say that by my lights, the reason why I'm an agnostic, and by that I just mean that from my research, so this is what I mean by calling myself an agnostic. From my own research, the reasons and evidence roughly counterbalances between theism and atheism, or the denial that God exists. From my own research, the evidence and reasons roughly counterbalance. That's how I understand my own position here. So why? Well, because I think that the reasons counterbalance. And what are those reasons? Well, I think a really powerful reason to think that God doesn't exist is the suffering rampant in the evolutionary process. So you think about hundreds of millions of years of these animals ripping each other to shreds. You've got parasitism, languishing, suffering, predation, just this bloodbath of evolutionary history. And we're not just talking. I mean, listen, like I reflect a couple years ago, right? There were these forest fires in Australia. They were really bad. I think this is around 2020, 2019. They were very bad. Thousands of koalas are burned alive, right? So you just think about that cuddly little koala, capable of suffering, being burned alive. Now think about thousands of them, okay? And now think about thousands of them, not just on a given day or a given span of weeks or months, but over centuries and like years, centuries, decades, like millennia, hundreds of millions of years now. Think about the rampant suffering in the evolutionary process. And these are little animals, right? This is not...
Somewhere in the world right now, there's a baby deer being born that's going to get eaten by a lion.
Or like a wolf.
Happened to get born, but the wrong place at the wrong time.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's not like, okay, what some religious thinkers say with respect to humans, like, oh, we have free will, oh, we can grow our souls, like we could become more virtuous. But it's like, you're not going to see the baby fawn growing more and more virtuous as it's being eaten alive by this wolf or something like that. That's so implausible. And like animals don't really seem to have the kind of free will that we do. So free will doesn't seem applicable. Soul growth, building up their souls. It's not like the pig is like, oh yes, I just experienced this sort of suffering and I'm going to grow from it. Like, no.
What about the dinosaurs? They're extinct now. What are they?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So just these hundreds of millions of years of suffering just seems so surprising on theism. I'm not saying that it's incompatible with theism. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's incompatible.
I know what you're saying.
Yeah, you can tell stories that can try to accommodate the data, and that's pretty much true for any theory. What I'm saying is that it's very...
That's what apologetics is.
Yeah, exactly. What I'm saying is just that it's very, 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 very surprising on theism. So that's one pretty powerful reason for atheism. And then reasons for theism, there are a bunch of different reasons, but one of them is actually some kind of contingency argument. So we look around, we do see contingent things, and precisely because they're contingent, they could have failed to exist. They could have been absent from reality. And given that seems to inspire the question, why are they in reality then, if they genuinely could have been absent?
Like, I think of like bacteria that have there's no purpose for them in the world other than their own survival. Like there's these little, or just like insects, like random insects that have no purpose in the circle of life at all. They're just there and you don't even need them. Like they could be gone. Nothing would change. Why is it? Well, why are they created then? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So, I mean, we have this kind of fundamental urge to ask why. And I think it's really latching onto something. Like in general, there are explanations for things. And I mean, we just constantly ask why. And so if we apply that to just the very fact that there are any contingent things at all, why? Why are there contingent things at all? Arguably, that gives us some weight of a reason to think that there is an explanation for that. And of course, the explanation can't be in terms of something contingent for reasons that we've already seen. And so there's arguably some sort of necessary foundation to reality. And of course, I think that gives some leg up to theism because, well, anyway, that sounds like God, a necessary foundation to reality. But of course, there are non-God type objects. You could say that it's some sort of foundational material thing or physical thing, etc. So that's why I get hung up on those sorts of arguments.
Well, that's another reason why deism is, if anything, is more plausible than theism, because when you look at life, if you need a creator that creates all life, it's like, well, then why would he need a male and a female to mate, and then that offspring's going to look like its parents? And did he create them, or does it have to be does it have to look like their, like, is he creating them, or does he need all these things to happen? And that process unfolds through thousands of years, and it's like, well, when does the creation happen? In the beginning of time? Did he plant all this stuff to happen and according to a plan? That's sort of like a deism, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense that he's stepping in every moment of the way to create a life, a person or an animal or whatever, if it has to be this person's the parent, this person's you know what I mean? It just doesn't, everything looks like natural selection rather than creation.
Yeah, and I mean, sophisticated theists, I think, well, let's set aside young Earth Christians. I think that has no chance of being true. Okay, so set that aside. I mean, sophisticated theists, like the intellectual, the philosophical ones, are going to say, yes, God used, of course, an evolutionary process, but that's the means by which he's bringing about biological diversity. And so God is kind of working through natural selection. So that's probably what they're going to say. But of course, I mean, that almost makes things worse for the problem of evil. It's like God is actively like taking the lion. He's like, this toddler is like, like eat the. It's like, it's kind of scary. But
that's a really good point, actually. Wow, good answer. Next one is from Derek again. He just double dipped. Agree or disagree? Philosophy is often word salad.
Good philosophy is never word salad, but there is some bad philosophy out there, similar to how there's bad science. I mean, bad science is often malicious, harmful, sometimes word salad, etc. And similarly, that's true with bad philosophy. And there is lots of bad philosophy out there, which is unfortunate, right? Which is one of the reasons why I try to popularize good philosophy and bring it on my channel and others. So yeah, good philosophy I don't think is word salad. Good philosophy really precisely defines terms, gives rigorous arguments for it, and gives reasons in support of those arguments, even draws on our best scientific results and so on, refines it, and really develops this worldview, this view of reality, how things in the most general sense hang together in the most general sense. So I would say bad philosophy, yes, that can and often is word salad. But good philosophy is very precise, rigorous, in tune, in line with our best scientific theories, and also brings in the insights from mathematics, from pure reason, etc. So that's what I would say.
I can't help but to think about Jordan Peterson, who I used to be a big fan of Jordan Peterson. I came from Christianity, and then I went to Gnosticism. Actually, now that I think about it, it might have been because of him. When I read that book, 12 Rules of Life, I was still a Christian, and I remember reading about the Gnostics in that book. That might have got me down that path, but either way, eventually became, I guess you could say, agnostic, atheist, whatever you want to call it, depending on how you define those words. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm not like, oh, there definitely is no God, but I am at the point where I look at all the religions that are available, and I don't think any of them are true.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess you can call that atheism. I don't know. It depends on how you define it. I'm also agnostic to there could be a God, there could be a creator, there could be a first mover. I don't know. You know, that's why I had these conversations. Why I have people like you on to figure, to get to the core of all this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, just to bounce off that just a little bit. Yes, I agree that Jordan Peterson is very often word salad. I mean, it's funny because like when you're listening to it, you might be like, oh, that's interesting. It's like you're kind of following along and you think it sounds deep.
You don't know better because you feel like, oh, he's a PhD. He works, well, not anymore, but at the time he was a professor at a Toronto University.
Yeah.
And he's throwing all these big words around. This guy's really smart. He must know what he's talking about.
Yeah.
But the more, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I was just going to say, the more you learn and the more I'm actually like picking apart what he's saying, I'm like, that doesn't even make any sense.
Yeah, exactly. No, yeah. No, it's all good. What I was going to say was like, you're listening to it and you're like, yeah, that's kind of plausible. That's interesting. And then you look at the text you convert it to text, right? Exactly. What he said, and you're like, what the hell? You're like, what is this? It's like meandering. It's like so weird. There's no unifying theme. It's like that is kind of word salad. But anyway, not always, of course. To people who are Jordan Peterson fans, clearly he says good things, etc. But sometimes he definitely goes into word salad territory.
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly. Yep. The next question is from Mr. Monster, another member of the channel. Does the devil work for God? It's an interesting question.
Well, suppose that I said, yes, the devil does work for God. That seems to imply that both the devil and God exist. And I'm not going to go so far as to claim that that's positively false, but I'm going to say that I'm not convinced that it's true, right? And so I would say either probably no, or I'm not exactly sure. But I guess I could, maybe they're asking, okay, within the story of Christianity or whatever, does the devil work for God? And that I can answer. Well,
depends on if you're looking at the Old Testament or the New Testament.
That might be true.
His role totally changes between the two.
That might be true. I mean, yeah.
In the Old, take Book of Job, for example, which scholars think is the oldest book in the Bible, older than Genesis. In that book, he's buddy with God. He's basically God's district attorney. God's the judge, and he's sitting there he's accusing. Well, that's what his name means. Satan is the accuser. And his job is to accuse Job. No, Job's not good. Let's put him to the test. Let's kill his family and see what happens. Like that's Satan. It's like he's God's boy. And then as the theology of the Jews unfolds down to Christianity, he becomes more and more of an opposite to God. And eventually you get to like this dualist worldview where it's God and Satan. But it didn't start off that way for sure. Definitely did not.
Interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I was thinking like, remember we were talking about these people who think that God is like meticulously controlling absolutely everything. I mean, it almost seems like, I mean, it would almost seem like the devil is in some sense, I don't know, like God is working through the devil, like actively intending absolutely everything that the devil is doing. So it depends on your model of God, maybe, and how you conceive of the relationship between God and his creatures and how they exhibit their freedom, right? How they manifest their free will.
Yeah, and then you have to, if you do had this Yahweh, who's the creator of all things, and he created the universe in 7 days, well, why is Satan allowed to live if he's the enemy, if he's the deceiver, if he's the one who's causing all these bad things to happen? Can't God just snap his fingers and make him go? Like, didn't he create hell? Doesn't it mean he created hell and the devil? Like, it's like one of those things that nobody really wants to answer because it really poses a lot of problems.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. This is one of the. So I guess I'll make one point. Well, here's one way that a theist could respond. They could say, well, there are various great goods that can come about from this kind of strife with evil, right? I mean, if you do have evil entered into the world through the devil or whatever and his powers, people genuinely have a choice between good and evil, and so that makes their choice for good more meaningful. People can battle against evil and grow their virtues of courage and compassion for other people who suffer and forgiveness for when they're wronged, etc. So they're probably going to say that there are various great goods that can come about from it, and that's why God kind of allows the devil, at least temporarily, to wreak some havoc on creation.
But what's interesting about that is they almost have to admit that he's allowing Satan to be there, right?
That is true.
Or else he's not all powerful.
Yeah, that is true. So that's an interesting. I mean, it's an interesting thing to go down, and then you could get into the question of, does that detract from God's power? And then the theists would probably say no, and you might argue yes, etc. So endless debates go on. But the second thing that I wanted to say, with respect to this, was it's interesting. Some people actually argue for universalism, sort of on the basis of what you've just, I guess, hinted at or articulated. Universalism for the audience is the view that eventually all shall be saved. All shall be reconciled to God, shall be redeemed, and shall be in heaven with God. And some people argue that, well, I mean, like, listen, if God is the foundation of reality, if he's this ultimate ground of being, if he's the source of being itself, of our being, well, then to separate yourself from God, right, is to separate yourself from the fount of reality, to separate yourself from the ground of being. And right. To do that, it would seem as though, like, if you're truly cutting yourself off from that, separating yourself from it, that is, then you're no longer existent. I mean, so then either it's annihilationism, which a lot of people don't want to go for, or else you're going to have to say all shall be saved eventually, which is interesting.
Yeah, that was a good answer. Good question. Good answer. I missed this one. I'm so sorry, Rex. I skipped you. I saw Myth Vision twice, and I just, for some reason, he was in between. I didn't even see it. So bad. I apologize. I try not to do that, but it happens. He says, what degree of free will can exist if there are multiple suprastructures of institutions, their hierarchy, and their dogma that exist? How much free will exists outside of generation indoctrination?
Yeah. So this is a good question because it recognizes, it recognizes that free will, in some sense, freedom comes in degrees, right? It's not like not necessarily an on or off switch. Like, you can be more free given that you're, let's say, in a more lucid state of mind, you have done more deliberation, you're more sane, etc. So you can have degrees of freedom. Like, right when you wake up, you might not be as free as you are later on in the day because, I don't know, you're kind of groggy, your mental capacities aren't really in full working order, but, you'd still be responsible to some degree, etc. So it's interesting that this question is latching onto that. So there are definitely factors that can mitigate or lessen your degree of freedom. One of them might very well be, let's say, generational childhood indoctrination, early teaching and socialization, etc. So, I mean, if someone is, let's say, unfortunately, they're growing up under, let's say, the apartheid in South Africa, they might have been indoctrinated into thinking that certain races of people are inferior to other races of people. And if they're indoctrinated or grow up in thinking that, and that's kind of just ingrained in them, it's like it becomes harder to blame them for it because they're so young, they're like growing, it's like the sea in which they live, right? They're not responsible for, at least in the early stages, for these kind of dispositions to treat people of other races poorly because that's just been ingrained in them through no fault of their own, right? And so they seem to be less free in that case if they go on later. or at least less culpable when they let's say do something bad to, like they're a child, and they say like they don't want to sit with someone else of another race or something like that. Now normally that would be like, hey, that's like not cool, that's not something that you should be saying. But I guess they're less free in respect of choosing who they sit with, because they were indoctrinated from such a young age to think poorly of certain people. So I guess it kind of just depends. It depends on the extent of the indoctrination. But I do agree that can definitely mitigate and lessen, and perhaps in some cases remove responsibility and freedom for certain choices. And I would say the same thing with institutions. I guess it just depends on how much they are indeed influencing you. And that's kind of, I guess, an empirical question that I can't really answer right here.
Yeah, that was good. Thank you for the super chat, Rex. Sabra Boswick, thank you for the super chat. She says, thanks, great conversation, thanks. So a couple minutes left. Just wanted to sort of wrap this up and sort of ask you your opinion on, I've heard you say this over numerous times, that you're agnostic, but you think the evidence is equally balanced on both sides.
Yeah.
What sort of, give me some examples of what balances you towards there being something like a deist or something.
Yeah. So one of them is the one that I was kind of briefly articulating earlier, where it's just, we look around and we see contingent things that could have failed to exist. And I really do think that it's plausible. It's plausible. I'm not saying they're like, this is absolutely certain, but I think it's plausible that contingent things have explanations outside of them. It's precisely because like it could have failed to exist that you wonder, it could have failed to exist. It could have failed to be here. Why is it, right? I mean, this water,
Right.
it didn't have to be here. So why is it here? There actually is an explanation, right? Someone produced it and brought it about. So like when I think about that and I think of the collection of all the contingent things that there are, it seems plausible by my lights that there's an explanation of why there is these contingent things. And of course, that can't be in terms of a contingent thing. It's going to have to be in terms of a necessary foundation to reality. And that at least gets you closer to God. And that's at least some sort of evidential chip, it seems. Because, I mean, there's a second stage of contingency arguments, right? You can break them down into two stages. The first stage is establishing that there's a necessary foundation. The second stage is trying to identify that with God. Now, I'm actually very skeptical of that second stage. But given that you've made it to the end of the first stage, it at least kind of raises the intellectual credibility of theism, right? Someone who isn't even committed to there being a necessary foundation to reality wouldn't even be in a position to accept theism. So that's like one chip, there being this kind of necessary foundation to contingency. I find that plausible. So that's one thing. I mean, a second thing is, let's see, one that's reasonably accessible. Because there are complicated ones like psychophysical harmony, and you're talking about like the laws between psychological states and physical states and how those have to be like finely tuned. It's complicated. I talk about that in my 100 plus argument video, so definitely check that out.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. But I guess one other one that pulls me towards theism is just the fact that there are conscious, free, rational creatures. I mean, there have to be a lot. Well, let me step back. Conscious, free creatures are incredibly valuable, right? Given that we are conscious and that we're free and we're rational, that kind of subserves, that helps further and promote various relationships and various relational goods that can come about. Like we can be in a relationship with our creator. We can be in a relationship with one another. We can engage in these sorts of worldview questions. Like all this is so profoundly valuable. And given that, God has a really good reason to actualize such a world containing conscious, free creatures and so on. So it's not at all surprising on theism that you would get a world with conscious, free, rational creatures. But on, let's say, naturalism or atheism, it seems much more surprising, much less expected that you would get such creatures. That's not to say that it's impossible, obviously not. But you have to meet various barriers, right? You firstly have to have a physical universe at all in the first place. Secondly, the physical universe has to be sufficiently regular and uniform, not like chaotic and things just either popping in and out of existence. You have to have relatively stable laws that allow for it. You have to have the universe go on and persist for a long enough time so that it has the requisite complexity to undergird life, and eventually not even just life, but you have to have various contingent things that really could have failed to happen, but right. Contingent things in the evolutionary process that build up that complexity firstly. So not just maintaining some kind of simple organisms for the whole of it, but you have to build it up eventually till you get consciousness. And not only that, but you have to have other further selective pressures come along, which is, again, highly improbable, just on chance, that you get these selection pressures eventually pushing it towards rationality and moral agency and so on. So it's just there are various barriers along the way where things easily could have gone otherwise, but they didn't. And those kind of compound on one another such that it becomes surprising. It at least becomes surprising on naturalism or atheism if there's no like guidance of this process. It becomes surprising that there would be such profoundly valuable creatures. So it's much more surprising on atheism or naturalism, whereas it's actually kind of expected on theism. So that gives us some evidence for theism. It gives you some weight of a reason to think that theism is true. Of course, it's not knocked down, and it's only like some evidence, right? But yeah. Anyway,
and then to add to that, but I'll say this: but if it is that just chance, and there's no deist, no mind behind this, just by chance, all these processes play out. Here we are, billions of years later. We would think that we would be like, this is a 1 in a gazillion chance. But that one, if that's what happened, that's what happened, and we would have no choice but to be like, "What? Why are we here? Why is there something and not nothing?" Right?
Yeah.
And so, it's like the one sperm that gets to the egg. It's like, why that one, not the other ones? But it just is that way. It just has to be. That's the process. There's always, and then, but also, we don't know what's outside of this universe. We don't know outside of this universe. There could be another universe somewhere else. It could be the same. Could be a whole million, could be an infinite amount of universes. Who knows? And another thing I thought about this, I'm not sure if any major philosophers ever thought about this, but like, people say everything's fine tuned, and I guess it is pretty much. But like, it does seem there are some flaws. Like, if this universe was fine tuned, for example, by a God that wants, you would think that there would be, I don't know, you would think that the Earth wouldn't be like in the middle. It would be like geocentric more, like everything would be focused more on just us. We're in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a random galaxy, in the middle of, like, we're just like a little speck, tiny little speck. Like in my intro I saw where you zoom out and you just see, like, it's like meaningless. It's like there's really, like, it doesn't make sense that a creator would just be like, I got this giant sandbox of galaxies and universes, and that little tiny thing that you can't even see unless you zoom in times 10 billion, and then you can finally see it, and this little speck in the middle of nowhere, I'm going to focus on that thing. Why? Yeah. So I don't know. It just seems like it's more plausible that by chance we're here.
Yeah, and I think it's just going to depend on which theories that we are comparing. Like, are we adding in that there's a multiverse? How will that affect the probability of our theory? It really just depends on the theories. And again, it'll depend also on your theory of God, right? I mean, under some theories, like as you point out, there are going to be various pieces of data that are really surprising, like that we're not in this geocentric one. But under other theories, like under other models of God, like God would want to inspire in us a kind of humility. Like, we're not this crown jewel. I mean, we have to have the requisite humility. We have to have this kind of insatiable curiosity to like search for things and to see that we're not this like ultimate jewel of creation and so on. And like, we can appreciate the artistic design of the universe, etc. So like, I guess it just depends, right? It depends on various other factors, how much evidence this is, and whether certain other things are going to be more or less expected. I mean, one of the things is really just inspiring humility, like, and that's a good thing, I think.
I think it's a fair response for theists to say that. And another thing they could say is God wanted to make it impossible that no matter how technologically advanced humans are, it's going to be impossible to make it past the cosmic radio background. He put that cosmic radio background as his like shield to get to him or wherever. I don't know. And like, that's the heavens beyond the cosmic radio background. And like, so like, we're so small, even if we get to the best, we can travel the speed of light, we'll never get past that thing. You could say that. I mean, I'm trying to give him some answer, I guess, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
That would explain why we're tucked in this little tiny pocket in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, I mean, it shows how frail and fragile we are. And I don't know, it almost gives us what this kind of philosophical theologian Richard Otto, who wrote what is it, The Idea of the Holy or whatever, he called it like this numinous sense, like this sense of awe, but also like almost fear and mystery. It's just like, because we're so small and we're like so fragile, we're so dependent on this huge concoction of factors like the sun being in the right place, like meteors and asteroids not coming and knocking us out of our course and so on. Like it does inspire in us a kind of a mystery, an awe, a fear, a kind of tremor, a kind of humility. And those are various goods that God might really want to instill in us, because those are good psychological states to be in, that we're not this hubristic, prideful crown jewel of things. So
I couldn't remember who I was talking to. I was talking to somebody who was saying that it almost seems like when you look at how the moon cycles like almost line up with the year cycle of this, with the solar, like you could almost get 12 moon cycles in a year, but it's a little bit off.
Yeah.
They're almost like, that might be, what if there was a creator and he wasn't perfect and he screwed up this universe and he made it a little tweaked off. That's why we all die. We're supposed to live forever, but he screwed up on our bodies and we die now. And then he just said, "Oh, I'm out of here. I'm making a new one," and just left it alone. Like that's a funny explanation of like why there's suffering and why the lunar cycles don't match up right. Everything's like a little bit off. Like he was trying to do something right.
It is interesting. I mean, it's like that would explain fine tuning. That would explain contingency, and it would also explain why everything is so imperfect and why, like, because there are some things that suck. But it's like, so that might have some explanatory power.
It's a fascinating way to look at it. I forgot who told me that, but I remember it. But I wish I could give credit to it, but I just can't remember who said that. Last super chat is from Robert Herring saying, "Just sending love." Thank you for the super chat, Robert. It's always good to see you here. And same with you, Sabra. Good to see you as always. And that is the last one. And by the way, I just want to show your channel once more. Go and subscribe, guys. This is a really good source for information. You interview great people. You get Dr. Graham Oppie all the time, and you know it really is. It's one of my I watch your videos pretty much every time you put out a new video. So
yeah, thank you.
I really recommend it. It's the philosophy of religions. Like this channel, like Derek's channel, we get into the text, like the Homer's Iliad versus the Bible, or Sumerian tablets versus. We're getting into like the stories and the text. You're doing all the hard work. You're getting into the philosophy behind all this stuff. That's the real core of this. So I credit you for that. And someone has to do it. It's not easy. This is not something you can just jump into. You have to know a lot of things, and you're out there doing it. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Make sure when you subscribe, hit that bell, hit that all bell. So, and someone just popped up real quick. Let's just hit this last one and we'll go. Einstein wrote a letter stating he didn't believe in God. Interesting. Thank you for the super chat.
That is interesting. I wonder, I've heard, like different speculations about his religious views. Like some people say that he's like a kind of Spinozistic pantheist. Yeah. Others say that maybe he was a deist. It's very interesting to think about these sorts of things. It'd be nice to talk to him about that.
I think there's a quote from him saying, "I literally believe in Spinoza's God."
Yeah. I mean, it'd be so interesting to sit down and talk with, like, dude, some of the physicists of the 20th century, they had the craziest, if you look into it, it's insane. Like a lot of them were idealists. Some of them were like, it's super cool. They were like pantheists, idealists. Like they had some really interesting, anyway.
The 20th century, even the 19th century too. There's some amazing thinkers that came out of that time.
Just these like 200 IQ thinkers. It's like they're latching onto something that we're all missing.
Yeah. I would say Einstein and Darwin are probably the two of the greatest thinkers of all time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, those two alone changed the world more than Jesus did. I think. I really do think that. Like Jesus gets more fame and he's been around longer, but Einstein and Darwin changed everything. They changed the way the world sees everything.
Absolutely.
But yeah, man, this has really been great, and we'll definitely do this again sometime. And let me just hit the outro, and you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.